Welcome back to Chapter 2. Next, we're going to be talking about some more basic HTML elements, including some concepts that you need to know if you're going to start developing your own pages. First things first, let's take a look at this basic example again. Hopefully by now you have a better understanding about how things work out with tags and sections and everything else. I won't explain too much on this. We'll jump into the next section. First thing you want to do is make sure that you understand blank lines, in this case new lines. I'm not talking about putting blank lines or new lines into your actual documents or the content. I'm talking about when you're developing the code itself. First things first, you always want to make sure that line number 1 is your doc type, as mentioned before. The last line in your page should be your closing HTML tag. The reason why this is, you want to go back into history a bit and learn about how computer programs were developed. When developers used to manually put in lines of code line by line instead of saving them into files, they would actually save the processing and the compiling until the person hit enter. This is the same concept. In this case, we're going to be using enter to create new lines to put our items on. The reason why you don't have blank lines or anything before your doc type is because any processor or any browser that's going to be taking this content will be looking for that doc type in order to understand what the document is. If it sees any new lines, it doesn't exactly know what to do. Computers are smart, they're not that smart. The last line, of course, should be your HTML tag, just so that when you're actually going through and developing these things, it knows exactly when to stop, instead of having extra blank lines, which of course eats up your bandwidth and everything else. So in this case, you want to make sure that the blank lines are after every item, and your first and last line are always the exact same. Next, let's talk about attributes and values. Hopefully in the basic example, you've seen this line right here, the meta char set UTF-8. We'll get to that in just a minute, but let's talk about what this means. First things first, we have an attribute and a value. The attribute is something that's inside the tag that allows a value to be set. If you ever set a value in algebra, you know that x equals 3. This is the same concept. The char set is x, and the 3 is the value. Or sorry, the UTF-8 is the value. So in this case, you have the capability to have a tag set a value to an attribute so that it knows exactly how to process this information and how to pass it off to the browser or anything else that's processing this information. Let's take another example of this image tag. In this case, the image tag needs a few items: the attribute of src or source, the value of logo.png, and the attribute of alt or alternative. In this case, logo is the value. This is just an example of these two tags. Once you start developing and getting more in-depth with the code, you'll understand what different attributes are for different tags. You can't just slap an attribute and a value into tags. You have to know exactly what tags can use what attributes and what values are accepted inside those inside the areas for the attributes. So let's also talk about the character set itself. The character set or char set in this case is UTF-8. Why UTF-8? Well, UTF-8 covers 99% of what is being used on the web today. This allows for the capability of different foreign characters such as Japanese, Spanish, Tagalog, Hebrew, or anything else, including special characters like stars, copyright signs, and even emoji. UTF stands for Unicode Transformation Format, and the 8 stands for 8 bits. You have other variations of UTF, such as 32 or 64, but 8 should cover 99% of everything that's going to be used on the web. You can also use different character sets, such as ISO 8859-1, Windows 1252, or other ones, but again, UTF-8 pretty much covers everything that you're going to be dealing with. The UTF is a character library that contains all the letters and symbols, also known as code points, in order to display what is needed, such as emoji. Next, let's talk about the title tag. The title tag itself is actually something that you can hard code to manipulate what the browser will be saying. Not just content on a web page, but you're actually manipulating the title area of a browser. Let's take a look at an example. If you were to see this, such as "Hello World, I like hiking," if you notice at the very top it says "My First Page." You can actually manipulate that so that it can change what it's going to say on different pages and even within the same page. So you can have the same content and have a different title. In this case, on the right it says "Bob's Photo World," just as an example. With this, you can change what the browser is saying in the title or the tab area and actually make it relevant to the page you're loading or looking at, and also if things need to be modified, such as live notifications like Facebook. If you notice in the code on the left versus the code on the right, the code on the left has the title tags, such as the opening triangle bracket title, the closing triangle bracket, my first page, and then the same tag with a slash. The same thing happens on the right with Bob's photo page. So both items are on the same page, but they're wrapped in between title tags. So essentially the element of title, or the container, has the content that's being displayed in the browser. Next, let's talk about indentation, or creating readable code. When you first start out, you may want to have everything left aligned just because it looks nicer to you. Well, eventually, once you start getting into more and more code, it's going to get very hard to determine exactly what code is where, what sections are where, and how things are broken up. So if you take a look on the left and compare it to the right, the left, although it has everything, is a little hard to understand, whereas the right, it's easier to see where the sections start, where they end, what items have what, and for example, you can see where the head and the body start and end, and what the content is inside each of the tags. Indentation is highly recommended for pretty much anyone that's a developer, so that you or anyone that's taking over your code can go into the system and see how things are broken up, instead of having to worry about going through each line, figuring out where things start and end. Let's also talk about relationships, or nesting. With this, when you're actually talking about using different tags and different code, you want to make sure that your starting tags and ending tags match in the order. You open or you close the tags in the opposite order that you open them. Let's take a look at this first example with the bold and italic text. You notice that inside the body, of course the body is an element, so it contains everything. Inside the P tag, you have the text of "this is some bold and italic text." The bold text is wrapped around a strong tag, which makes it bold, and the italic text is wrapped around an EM, or emphasis tag, making it italic. In this case, all the items are separate, and you have what's called a parent-child relationship between the P tags and the strong and EM tags. The strong and EM tags by themselves are sibling elements, or sibling-sibling, depends on exactly how you're going to say it. In the example below, you notice that it says this text is bold and italic. The main difference is that the items bold and italic start out with a strong and EM tag, and then they close the EM tag and the strong tag. So everything closes the exact opposite way it opened. That way, it's kind of like having different items in boxes. You want to close one box before you can close another box. Otherwise, if you don't, it can get very confusing. Because if you have bad relationships such as this, in this case this text is bold and italic, it's the exact same content, but if you notice the order of the tags, the P tag EM strong and then the P tag EM strong at the end, it looks okay, but once you start processing and validating, it comes up really, really weird, and it doesn't know exactly where things go and how things are ordered. In this case, this would be a very bad example, and if you validate this, which we'll get to in a bit, this would come up as a validation error because it doesn't know where things end and where the next thing begins. So, you can always have tags inside of tags, but if you're going to have tags inside of tags, you want to make sure that those items are wrapped appropriately. You can wrap P tags inside of P tags or paragraph tags, but it's just bad code to do so. You want to save these for displaying the content and manipulating the content inside of it. We'll get to that in just a bit. Some editing techniques. First off, save early and save often. It is easier to undo one item than it is 1,000. By the time you get down to the 1,000th line of your code, it's going to get very, very hard to go back and figure out exactly what needed to be fixed and what can be undone. You also want to test early and test often, just like with the saving, because if you're developing something, you want to make sure that each step as you're developing it works out before you're moving on to the next one. If you just code 1,000 things at once and you save and you figure out that one thing doesn't work, it's easier to go back and figure out that one thing instead of going through and narrowing down each of those 1,000 items. So again, save and test early and often. When you're viewing code in your browser as processing the code in the browser, you want to make sure that you make the refresh button or command or control F5. 3, 2, 1. When you're viewing code in your browser, basically having the browser process your code, you want to make sure that the refresh button or command or control R or F5 is your best friend. Like I said before, save early and test early and often. So that way once you go through, you know exactly how things are being manipulated and modified before we're moving on to the next item. So that button right there, make sure that is your best friend. Any changes you have in your document, you save, you go back to the browser, you refresh, because the browser will not automatically update for you. If you have live or preview mode turned on with brackets, it can work, but if you try to save something, it won't exactly show you the best option. It may work on smaller examples, such as what we're working on, but once you start getting into more advanced systems, it's going to get very complicated and not show you what you need to see before trying to edit things. That's the end of this section. In the next section, we'll talk about more HTML tags. So please, if you have any questions, let me know and I'll get back to you the best I can.